Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Kathy Soder. Let's move the air after that. University Park, and we talked about the things that are rising up in conversation. One of them was methane and grazing system is a constant question that lots of us get, but we can't answer with questions about that. So Kathy proposed it. I thought it was an excellent idea. So pass it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Jen. I don't know about answers, but we'll put out what's out there right now and maybe where we are. Again, we're going to talk about enteric methane in grazing systems today. You know, the grazing system is taking a big rap with agriculture as a whole as being methane producers and greenhouse gas producers. But looking at where we are with enteric methane, and by enteric methane, I mean that's coming out of the animal itself. What's into the evacuations, the burps, not the farts, like people like to think. And there's some funny memes out there on that, but it's not really coming out that end of the animal. So when you're looking at how much greenhouse gas and how much methane ruminant livestock produce, it's really going to depend on two things: what source you're looking at and how they're describing it, what unit they're putting to it. And so some of the sources have livestock producing about 14.5% of global anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, and methane's being one of the primary sources, and it's also one of the most potent as well. And so about 10% of total US greenhouse gases. That's worldwide. This is as United States. It's been proposed by the FAO that almost half of methane emissions are from grazing ruminants. Again, we'll take that with a grain of salt because there'll be some data I'm going to show you here that may support or may disprove this. And grazing ruminants may have greater methane emissions due to decreased animal performance from high forage diets. They're a little bit less efficient a lot of times than if we're feeding a ration in the barn, or if we're finding that we're getting more production per animal. And that's the next point I want to make, is it really depends on how we're reporting methane. And we're going to look at these three measures, units of measure, in some of these studies and show you what differences there are. We have methane production, which is grams per day. How many grams of methane per day is that animal producing? And then the second two measures rely on variables such as dry matter intake or milk production, could be average daily gain in beef animals or small ruminants, but grams per kilogram of dry matter intake. So if we're producing so many grams per day, but we're eating more, your intensity is going to be, or your yield's going to be a little bit less because you're spreading that over more dry matter intake. Same with milk production or gain. We have the same amount per day, but we have greater milk production, we're diluting it. Solution to pollution, dilution to pollution, or solution to pollution is dilution, right? So how do we quantify methane in our animals? Confinement, I won't say it's easy, but it's certainly easier than it is in grazing systems. It makes sense. We can put them in chambers, we can put them in a head chamber, you know, we can measure what's coming out of the animal. A little bit tougher on pasture, because we can't just put them in a head chamber, we can't put a chamber in them. One of the older methods, and I have done this method, and it is not fun, is with a tracer gas, SF6, which is also a greenhouse gas in itself. So we're putting that in the environment, and it's also can be carcinogenic. But what they do is you put a SF6 in a bolus, and we have to measure for 3 or 4 months how much is coming out. It's a constant rate. Each bolus is different. So we need to know what's coming out of that bolus. And then we have a complex system where we have a vacuum chamber on the back of the animal with a hose down to its nose so that it's constantly sniffing the air. And so using this tracer gas, we can measure we know how much tracer gas is coming out, it's like dealing with digestibility measures. We can use it to quantify how much methane is being produced per day. With these systems, you can imagine cows love to chew on each other, they pull them off, and things fail, the vacuum fails. So it's not always an easy system. We have a newer system, some people know it as a green feed system, where it's a headlock or a head chamber. And what this does is it's a sniffer. When cows attracted to the unit, it looks like a mineral feeder. Attracted to the unit by some type of feed, which is a bait feed in there. They get a little bit of, and they come in. They all have individual collars or ear tags. So they know which cow comes in. And when they come in, there's sensors all around that tray, and it sniffs the air while the cow's in. Cow just has to be in there a minute or two and then get it. Cow can visit many, many times a day. So the more data we get, the better it is. And one of these units can measure up to about 20 cows without being too competitive amongst cows. And this is a pasture unit because you can see the solar panels here. It's on a trailer. If it wasn't, if it was in a barn, it would just be this unit right here. And yeah, it looks like a modified mineral feeder. But when we're looking at our grazing animals, we have a lot of variable responses. We have environmental responses, you know, just the sunshine, yesterday to today would be a good example, very different environmental conditions, heat, moisture, our forage conditions, how we're managing them. Are we modulating them by, you know, through our forage selection, nutrient cycling, if we're rotating them faster, slower, through different types of forage, different types of soils. And ultimately impacts forage quality and quantity. And this is a big factor in the methane production of these animals. There's a lot of social interactions, not that there isn't in the barn. I think we have a lot on pasture too, if we have different areas of forage that are either very favorable towards the animals, where they're going to avoid some areas. We're going to have dominant cows, we're going to have subordinate cows. And then we have a lot of individual differences as well. You know, previous experience, we're talking about some of that this morning, putting naive heifers out on pasture, or if we have experienced animals. And there's a lot of epigenetic stimuli that we don't really understand yet. What's happening in the womb of that mother before that calf or that young animal is born. And I think there's a lot to be done there that can affect animals in their lifetime. So what's the importance of pasture management? I think this is one of the keys for us, and for any manager of ruminant livestock, is our forage management. You know, and we say that all the time, but it really is here. Because improving our grazing management can help mitigate methane. And if we have more efficient use of our grazed forages, we'll have more efficient conversion of forage into meat and milk. So if we have the same forage, we're producing more meat and milk, right? We're going to dilute that methane over more product. So we have fewer animals or less land that we need to produce the same amount of product. And this study, the Ramus et al. Showed a 22% reduction in projected methane annual emissions from beef cattle just by improving grazing management. And their study was more of a plan for continues to improve rotational management. I don't care what fad label you want to put on it right now, just put improving your grazing management will help. On the other hand, stocking rate of heifers on pasture showed no effect on methane emissions, another study that was done. And so there's a lot of contradictory research out there that I think a lot of it is different conditions. We don't have the same forage conditions. We don't have the same animals. We don't have the same microbiome. Bugs in these animals and don't have the same conditions that really make it kind of hit and miss. We would think that if we had grasses with higher sugar or higher soluble carbohydrates, modeling would suggest that greater sugar content should increase methane. Why would that be? We're increasing rumen digestibility with a little bit more energy in there, and there's a very direct correlation between methane and dry matter intake and methane and nutrient digestibility. You increase those, you increase methane. There's more activity in the room, so you're going to have more methane. And but a study showed no effect of high sugar grasses and dairy cows on methane emissions. So again, getting this, and you really have to dig in the differences in the studies. And really, even if we do, then there's differences, but until we have enough studies under these conditions and enough studies under these conditions to really compare, really early in the game. So a lot of our strategies are, of course, animal management, pasture management, genetic selection. There's a lot of work going on in that, looking at feed efficiency in animals, and also the rumen microbiome, which I think is a really new and hot topic, and one that I don't understand really well when you put all those graphs up there. But it's really interesting to see what can be done through rumen manipulation. And then, of course, nutritional modulation. We can feed them different products or feed them different ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. But in the end, we're looking at trying to promote more efficient systems to increase that plant and animal performance, to reduce the inputs, whether those inputs are how much land, how many animals, how much fertilizer, how much corn, how much whatever the input is, to reduce that methane intensity. So some of the feed additives that are out there, 3-NOP's kind of been in the media lately. There's a product that's just been out, and there's some concerns from consumers and others about the safety of the product. But what it does is a product that will modify the rumen microbiome and decreases the effect of the methanogens, the bacteria that produce the methane in the rumen. And it's been shown to decrease methane emissions in dairy cows by 20 to 40%. So it is quite effective. But with little or no change in milk yield or composition, because that's always the question, right? I can feed this and it decreases methane, but what's it doing to my production? What's it doing to my bottom line? And some of the studies are showing that the results are affected by dietary fiber content. Now, I don't know of many or any grazing studies done with this product. It's been mostly confinement studies, but fiber content has been shown to impact it. There's plant-based products or secondary compounds is maybe a better way to put it that can affect methane emissions. Condensed tannins, and we know it has other positive effects in animals, anthrometic effects, and some others. Saponins and essential oils, and there's others as well, probably some that we don't know about. And they've shown some promise in vitro. I mean, you can do it in the lab in a test tube or in a vat, and it's shown promise, but what's it do in the animal as a whole? And that's difficult to translate without doing large scale studies. Because if we're getting, some of these products also reduce ruminal function and animal production, which again, methane is highly correlated to digestibility and intake. So if we're reducing it, it may just be correlation if it always causation, it may just be a secondary effect. Another area we've done a little bit of work in this is some of the seaweeds that are out there. There's some red seaweeds and some others that are out there that can reduce methane by up to 98%. But what's it doing in the animal is very expensive right now, because right now they're not really growing these, they're wild harvesting these in Portugal and some other countries. So what's the environmental impact of that? And the compound that is shown to reduce the methane, one of them is a bromoform. And me and others have shown that the bromoform stability is not there. It decreases over time. The product itself is very sun sensitive, so we have to keep it in the dark, we had to keep it in the refrigerator. But if somebody would perhaps take this bromoform and find a product or make a product, and make a promise there, but again, there are still issues with any of these that are here. And again, very limited, if any, long-term animal responses. They're very short-term studies, 5, 6, 8 weeks animal studies, 6 weeks in vitro studies. We don't know what's happening long-term on herd effect, or what other effects that they have. Could be reproduction, could be cheese making ability. We don't know what is happening long-term in these animals. I think one thing we can really get at, and we're all trying to do, is increasing the feed efficiency of our animals. If we can feed them less feed and get more product, right, we're all better off. Because we have fewer inputs, we may have greater carrying capacity on our pastures, and we can keep more animals there. But there has been data showing that you can decrease, or by increasing feed efficiency, you can decrease methane 12 to 28%. First one was on a high concentrate diet, second was high quality pasture, and the third one was on grass silage. And these were done at Chagas in Ireland. If you get a look for it, it's not spelled that way. It's an Irish word, so it's TEA. GASC, Chagas. They have a lot of research. I'm going to cite some of their work here. So they're looking at ways to improve feed efficiency in grazing dairy cows to reduce methane impact. We can use supplementation strategies, and one of the obvious ones, if we feed them concentrate, now for grass fed we can't do that, but if we're not grass fed, but there's been contradictory results. Concentrate isn't always the answer, because we say, okay, high forage diets are producing more methane, feeding concentrate should reduce methane, right? But when we're feeding concentrate, we're substituting for forage, right? But when we feed concentrate, we're getting increased total dry matter intake. Maybe reducing the forage intake, but we're getting substitution effect of that concentrate and getting greater total dry matter intake. So we're going to have greater ruminal fermentation of the diets. So we're going to have ruminal fermentation, and ruminal fermentation is directly related to methane, right? We're going to have increased ruminal passage and decreased ruminal pH in some other studies, which if we're increasing passage and decreasing pH and decreasing ruminal digestibility, they showed a decrease. First study showed an increase in methane in grams per day. And if we have an increase in that total dry matter intake in animal performance, we may not change the total produced. But if we have the same amount produced over greater production, we're reducing the intensive dilution. But is it really decreasing total methane produced? It's not. We can use lipids or fats to increase the energy density of the diet. You can decrease methane by 60% in the study, but what's probably happening is coating the microorganisms. And of course, you get too much fat in the diet, you're going to have detrimental effects on the rumen, because it can be toxic, and it can be toxic to the methanogens. These are the bugs that produce the methane. And also, when we're feeding these fats, some of these unsaturated fatty acids that result in the rumen can capture the hydrogen, because they're trying to make saturated fatty acids. They want to saturate it totally and adding hydrogens. And they can scavenge the hydrogen that would otherwise maybe converted into methane, CH4. So even though high forage diets typically have greater methane output, it's not always an answer. It's kind of another, somebody was saying on the tour yesterday, it depends, and it really does depend. Because we can have results in either direction. Again, going to some studies that were done overseas, and cows grazing annual ryegrass and oats that were supplemented with either corn silage or ground corn, the yield, the grams per kilogram of dry matter intake decreased, but the grams per day and the grams per kilogram of milk did not change. So this to me is the important. We didn't change the number of grams that are being emitted into the environment. So if we have those animals, did it really help? Numbers might be a little bit small. This is the control with no supplementation. They were feeding about 6 or 7 pounds of corn silage on a dry matter basis, and then about 8 or 9 pounds of ground corn there. And the numbers aren't important, it's just the differences. So no differences in production. Grams per day was the same across the board. This is the standard error. So when we look at the yield, the grams per kilogram of dry matter intake, when we're feeding these supplements, we're increasing dry matter intake. So if we're producing the same amount, but diluting it over greater dry matter intake, it looks like we have less methane. But do we have less methane? No, we don't. But if we look at the intensity per grams per kilograms of milk, or this is energy corrected milk, they correct it because different cows will produce different amounts of fat and different components in the milk. So we try to standardize it with energy corrected milk. So these supplements do allow for reduced herbage intake substitution, but the milk production remained the same. So we really didn't see a benefit in this in the grams per day. But if we have greater intake and if we would have had greater milk production, then we might see an efficiency effect, but we weren't seeing that. Another study that looked at feeding incremental amounts of concentrate, they were feeding about roughly 4, 8, 12, and 16 or 17 pounds of supplement to grazing dairy cows per day. Similar results for grazing or grams per day and grams per kilogram of dry matter intake. So our production and our yield were similar. The intensity decreased, but that's because they had increased milk production. So they had the same amount, greater milk productions, had better efficiency. But there's also to be considered, what's the impact of these inputs? If we're importing corn, if we're importing nutrients, if we're looking at that, and that's where you have to get into life cycle analysis, which is a big picture, and it's not very easy to do. If you would sit down and write all the inputs and all the outputs on your farm, how many would there be? A lot. Astounding number. That's right. You know, and that's what a life cycle analysis is. When you have to look at every input and output, you say, oh yeah, we're going to feed more grain if we're importing from the Midwest. If we're importing seaweed from Portugal, you know, what's the impact of that? Yeah. So one study we looked at was supplementing flaxseed. We did an on-farm study throughout the Northeast. We had farms all over the Northeast in 5 different states, and looked at methane and output and ruminal fermentation. This was the initial study that we did before the on-farm study to look at effects. Is when we're looking at how much we want to feed, we don't necessarily want to do that in a cow because we feed too much. It's going to be detrimental, possibly more, you know, fatal to the cow. So we look at it in vitro, kind of a screening tool. So what we did is we fed 0, 5, 10, and 15% flaxseed, and that's a percentage of the total diet dry matter. So when we did that, you can see that when we fed 0%, we had the highest methane. It decreased a little bit at 5%, but somewhere between 5 and 10%, it really dropped because it dropped to 10% and not much between 10 and 15%. So when we went to the on-farm study, I think we chose 6%, 0, 5 or 6%, looking at where that drop was, because we did not want to go higher because of the fat content of the flaxseed, you couldn't go a lot higher than that. But you can see that methane did significantly decrease. But it's
linseed meal or whole flax?
It was whole flaxseed. It was not, there's nothing extracted out of it. It was a whole seed. We also though saw a decrease in nutrient digestibility. Once that flaxseed went into the diet, we did decrease in nutrient digestibility. This is organic matter and neutral detergent fiber digestibility in those bluish gray bars. So what's that going to do in the animal? We can't answer that with our in vitro system because it's just a simulated rumen in a vessel. But what does that do to the animal? When we went to the on-farm study, we were seeing some depression in milk. And there were some benefits in components, but depression and milk yield. And it's an expensive supplement to feed. So that was the problem. That was the big problem, because this was a number of years ago, but again, it's an expensive and sourcing it. Some of these farmers wanted to grow it, but it's not in this feed very to grow either. So there were a lot of questions at the time about flaxseed, and it's kind of come and gone, but it is one that will suppress methane a little bit, but there's other issues with it as well. To skip to the red seaweeds, this was, I did Portugal and Australia, and it contains those bromoforms, which do inhibit certain types of bacteria. And this one in particular, the Asparagopsis taxiformis, is the one that contains high amounts of bromoform and possibly other compounds that we haven't identified yet. So again, this is my in vitro system. If you can see, there's a vessel there and a vessel there. We have two of them. There are 3-liter vessels that we put rumen fluid in from a cow. Or from the couple cow, we mix it and put it in, and then we can feed them. And we can feed them whatever we want and measure the output. We can measure what's coming out in fiber and dry matter, and we can measure the volatile fatty acids and the pH and the ammonia and all that fun stuff, methane. And so we can simulate a rumen. It's not perfect and it doesn't do the whole track, but it is a good screening tool. So when we did this, we looked at feeding the 0, 0.5%, 1%, and 1.5% of diet dry matter in this red seaweed. And what we found is production. You can see here that once we started feeding any level of seaweed, we couldn't detect methane anymore. And the first period we did that, we do repeated periods, we thought that we were doing something wrong. And it was just below detectable levels. And so it basically bombed out methane. And you'd think that would be good, right? But we also had a nutrient digestibility decrease. And that bromoform, as I mentioned, is unstable. So you can see our nutrient digestibility up here from the 0 down and right down. As we increased our seaweed, you decreased nutrient digestibility. Forage brassicas is another example of a forage because it contains some of the secondary compounds. Glucosinolates is one that's really in the brassicas. And it's a good forage. We're talking about a lot of alternative forages for summer grazing, winter grazing. Grazing right now, because it is winter hardy. And it could, it's a good high biomass, high nutritional value, and it does show a reduction in enteric methane emissions, and it can be used, either as a crop itself or as a cover crop that sprays alongside another crop that it was interseeded with. So one study we did a number of studies, but we partnered with the University of New Hampshire, who has an organic grazing dairy herd, and we partnered with them, and we were grazing canola, which is one of the brassicas. So we had cows that were either in the barn 24/7. This was a late fall at this time of year, or October, November study. In the barn on baleage plus some supplements, or just a low-level supplement, or they were in confinement during the day and went out on pasture at night on a canola pasture. And this was, again, these are the short-term studies, 5-week study. But for us to, first of all, we wouldn't have been able to continue that for months, because you can't keep grazing that for months and months, because you're going to run into winter, you're going to run out of forage. And so what we did there is we replaced 2/3 of the baleage with canola by giving them an allotted forage availability in the pasture. And so what we found is that we did increase dry matter intake by 5%, but milk yield decreased by 5%. I think it's just passage rate. They were eating more, but it's passage. Everybody ever stand behind cows on a high brassica diet? You need your raincoat, right? Yeah. So you got a high passage rate. If it's not staying in a rumen and it's moving through, you're not going to absorb those nutrients. So it did reduce methane production, to the reason the green feed system on these, and yield, and it did decrease methane by 15%. But if we're losing 5 or 7% of our milk, is it worth it for that effect? We use brassicas for other reasons, or maybe you need to do a different brassica or a different mix. Including multi-species storage. We're going to talk about that this morning. We like our biodiverse storage, and there's a lot of benefits there that you can see. But there's also some possibility that it may help with methane emissions as well. And again, we're going back to Ireland to these chocolate studies. So they did a lot. You're going to see some species here that we may or may not have here, but it's what they did. So they had cattle that were fed with a high legume, they called it a high legume, but it was 20% legume. And they showed a reduction in methane emissions. And their legume would probably be clovers, primary clovers, white clovers, price and red clovers. So they did show a reduction in methane emissions, and what was white clover. They showed an increased ruminal passage rate. Again, standing behind the animal, you get a lot of legume in a pasture, it's going to come through faster. So they could potentially reduce methane emission with white clover. But they also saw increased milk yield to solid with the same or lower level of methane output. So if we're getting more milk but the same methane, that's a little bit more efficient, right? So if we're looking at strictly from methane, we're getting a little bit of a benefit there. They also work with a lot of pasture herbs. We might call them forest weeds. There's a lot of names for them. This is their terminology. So there's a lot of these alternative forages that are in our pastures have a lot of secondary compounds that have evolved over time to protect the plant, to help it survive or reduce predation, whether it's insects, livestock, whatever. So they had, you can see the mix there, sorrel, oxeye, daisy, yarrow, knapweed, ribwort, plantain, and they fed it as haylage. And they saw a reduction in methane by 10% compared to perennial ryegrass monoculture. And they also showed improved animal performance with the animals that were grazing the multi-species. Not surprising, right? We get our diverse pastures. But if we have directly lower methane emissions and reduce the intensity, there's a benefit there. And then look at all the other benefits that we have in our biodiverse pastures.
That's production, and we can start
I've heard this being yes, because they have very monoculture or monoculture, they've got one or two perennial ryegrass and white clover. It's very standard for that, is what you're saying, where our pastures can have 20, 40, 50 species in them. Probably 3 or 4 or 5 predominant species, which is usually, unless we've done some things wrong, some legumes and grasses. So that could be, yeah, the baseline could be different, but if we could do something or maybe add some of these weeds that we're currently trying to get rid of, or there might be something we have here that would be beneficial that to include, but we're not looking at that. We're not really, but yeah, I see what you're saying there.
But like even in the US, I think the region has to be because of flood.
Yes, different, and that's the big question. Different regions have different forage and different, and even different animals and genetics with what's happening in the gut. You put the same, there's been research showing that if you take 2 rumen fistulated animals and empty their rumen, and you measure the microbiome, what's in each one of them, and you swap them, the microbiome, the content of the rumen, it'll go back to what was originally the animal. They lose. So there are genetic effects on biodiversity.
And with earlier, the vaccines, algae, how much of the relationship the methane to health of the animal?
Yeah, like if he's being an anti-inflammatory versus drain.
Yeah, we have people online. Yeah, the question was about omega-3 and the black meat study and the animal compared to the question. I don't know. Yeah, no, that's a great question. The other thing to look at with these adverse systems is that if we're including legumes, you're going to reduce your nitrogen fertilization. Back to that life cycle assessment, right? We need to look at that bigger picture. What are we doing for nitrous oxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions through reducing our inputs? I'm just going to touch on this because it's the microbiome. And again, this is done in Chagas in Ireland, where they're really getting into this. I mean, what's happening at the rumen level of the animal, the different bacteria and other organisms that are there. So they had white clover inclusion at 12%, or I'm sorry, at a white clover grass mixture and a perennial grass mixture, and they reduced methane by 12% with the white clover. We're getting back to it again, Lucas, is that where we're starting? We don't know. With no effect on milk yield. But what they saw when they included the clover, so they had similar milk yield, reducing methane, and just to show you the differences in the bacteria. These are 2 different classifications of bacteria. It doesn't matter what they are, one's methanogens, one's something else, but you can see there's a shift. Whenever they went from just grass to clover, there were more of these beneficial, and some of the methanogens that were in there, that's not this one, decrease in there. So they're shifting the bacterial and the microbial population of the rumen through diet, and I think there's a lot to be said to that through dietary manipulation and also genetic manipulation of our animals, and genetic selection of our animals. So some of the keys to reducing enteric methane in our grazing systems, I think, for optimizing our animals, getting those cows bred, as first calf heifers, getting them on the ground, getting a good calving interval out of them, with dairy beef and our extra ruminants too. Don't keep those inefficient animals. I mean, Ed was talking about getting rid of some of those inefficient animals during a drought. There's probably other benefits to doing that. You're looking at life cycle assessment, and that's a big picture, big part of it as well. Improving the production of our animals, there's trade-offs there for improving production, we're probably putting more into them, more input, feed costs go up. Well, what's the efficiency of the system? Life cycle assessment. We improve our grazing management. Again, there are all kinds of nuances of grazing management and what we call them and how we do it. But if we keep improving our grazing management, that's going to improve our efficiency and improve our production and reduce our overall carbon footprint. Improving that forage quality and diversity. You can consider supplements and feed additives. I think it's just something to watch if it's an option for somebody, and there might be something that comes along that we're already using that we're seeing has a benefit. And improving feed efficiency, genetics of the animals, nutrition and management. It's a lot of the foundations of our systems, but there's just so many benefits to it. So taking a quick look at life cycle assessments. We need to look at that whole integrated system. We can't just look at the animal, we gotta look at the soil, we gotta look at the air, we gotta look at the water, we gotta look at the plants, everything. And so all those inputs can be considered. And I said, if I handed paper around, told you to start writing them all down, we'd be here for a while doing that. That's why it's so challenging doing research as well. So we have to look at all that though, but and we can do modeling, but are we modeling everything efficiently? Are we doing it accurately? Tamie, is all yours accurate? It could use more data. Yeah, she's our modeler, so she always need more data. But we need this to build these life cycle assessments, to build these whole system impacts. And I think that's where we could look at it, because we might suppose your cows are producing more methane per animal. What are you sequestering and carbon in the soil? There's just all kinds of questions out there. We just want that greater efficiency. So again, just to kind of pictorial, what's happening there? People say, oh, I'm selling milk. You're selling meat too, right? If you're a dairy farm, you might be selling pork, you might be selling all kinds of stuff. You're selling calves, you're selling, anything that's out there. So you have to think about all those inputs and outputs. So to summarize here, the big picture. Grazing ruminants produce really a similar, still does a little bit more methane per day than a confinement animal, but consuming well-managed systems on both accounts. But improving production efficiency anywhere in any of these systems is important. And it's only part of that carbon footprint. We talked about other things that are happening in the system, where our manure goes, how our manure is being composted or fermented or put back on the field. What are we losing there? What are we losing in the water? What are we sequestering in the soil? And we need those LCAs, those life cycle assessments to evaluate the environmental impact of any of our production methods. Nobody thinks about a lot of times the inputs. You go to the feed store and you buy something. Well, what's the cost of getting it to the feed store to get to you? I don't care if it's a bottle of penicillin, a pound of corn, or whatever, a bale of hay, whatever it is. There's a cost to get it there. There's an environmental cost to get it there. Even if you say, oh, I'm producing my own, there's an environmental cost to that as well. And it's not, the one thing I'll end with is it's not a we versus them scenario. I am not comparing grazing with confinement. I will not compare grazing with confinement. There's a place and a need for everybody. You could disagree?
I just said, why not? That helps educate a consumer for a climate.
Well, no, we can promote our systems without putting down another system. That's what I don't like about
You share the numbers, you don't have to put them down.
You share the numbers, but again, you gotta find unbiased data too. A lot of times, even in the research, you gotta look, it's biased one way or the other, or it's how it's reported. Greater intensity or less intensity, but the production per day was the same, so we're really farther ahead. We don't know. But that's why, promote the benefits of your system and show what you're doing well. And everybody can benefit from that. But I don't like the me versus them scenario. So with that, I will quit. And I see a question in the back, Dave.
So there's been a little bit of public, in the public press about a new product that Mr. Gates is promoting with some of the United Kingdom dairies. Is it Bovalier or Bova or something? What is it? Is it any of the ones that you promoted modality?
It's 3-NOP. It's that first one that I mentioned a while ago. Yeah, it's 3-NOP, and that's the one I alluded to that has some
attention right now. I haven't seen it through to see what's warranted and what's not, but I do think there's some unanswered questions. There is no need this.
There is comparison between human species. Which is not the word.
That I don't know. question about whether there was a comparative agreement of species, like cattle versus sheep versus goats or something like that. There's, when you look at what you can produce on land per acre, there might be some efficiency differences, but as far as direct methane, I don't think so, not that I know of.
And so, I mean, it doesn't mean, like in the human body,
John, I know.
you're saying, Kathy, in the human body, they talk about, humans should get about 200 minutes of exercise a week. Cholesterol is lower and everything functions better in the body. Have they done anything regarding exercise in animals? Just thinking, well, if maybe things are one thing that they can talk about faster. It's not just what they're eating, but they're living exercise. Right?
As far as the health thing, I don't know, I mean, we see stuff like you see stuff like cattle meat, you see stuff like that, but as far as the internal, you'll see high cholesterol in our cows or anything like that. I do know what you mean, and I have not seen that, because on the flip side, you see they're walking around getting more exercise, but you're also burning energy that you're put the milk production. They're trade-offs to everything.
I have two questions. They're both part of the life cycle analysis. Do you have any people like you asked looking at methane reduction from soil miles, soil?
Not directly, Kurt's been doing a little bit with more with carbon than anything, but, as ARS, I believe there's some research happening, but not right in our lab.
Well, just a comment on that. I've heard of few reports implying that there might actually be more reduction in that in the soil than we got in the adding of top to produce. That's why I was thinking, get ahead. And then the second question, which is also part of the this is more. Having worked in the natural gas business, previous job in my life, there's a difference between methane production from natural gas and cattle. Cattle methane is just a cycle. And it's, if you do nothing to change individual animal performance, it's still kind of a constant cycle. Whereas when we bring in natural gas or allow it to get off the well without being burned, that's new methane, which is a totally new greenhouse gas.
I agree with you on that, and I think, it goes back to, I don't know if there's a low hanging fruit that's easy to pick on.
Yeah, no.
Nobody wants to do another natural gas plant or natural gas, whatever they have, but all just pick on the house. But back to the soil microbiome, that's another big area that's happening, a lot that's happening under the soil we don't know about. And that we're still trying to understand.
And you mentioned carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
And a lot of those things. It also comes back to this yield, how we measure yield in pasture. If the cows are only eating half of the forage, so we're looking at methane produced based on the half they ate. How about the carbon they didn't eat that's left there on the surface of the ground?
Yep, and we have had some folks in our lab that are working on carbon sequestration,
Carbon sequestration isn't a never ending thing either. It can reach a saturation level. So I've had it happen here for 30 years, are we still sequestering carbon? Probably, but at what rate?
The previous question on different units. What about buffalo? Have anybody looked at what the original numbers of buffalo emitted?
That's always the question, I always come back to the license over it. And, you would respond to that? Oh, okay. No, I mean, there is a response. That's a good question, and there is, but I think, again, we're back to agriculture, low hanging fruit, because we didn't have all the parts, we didn't have all the people, we didn't have all the other things that are emitting. Or is it just a natural cycle in the world? We talk about global warming, global cooling, and recycling. But again, that's a good question, and there were lots of them, but they're all very different things.
Well,
In terms of the cycle.
right, but maybe they don't emit.
Their reputation.
I would, you can put the SF6 on the bison and let me know how it turns out. Or you're gonna breathe you, I can imagine them not beating up and moving.
Just in terms, I mean, I like the life cycle, again, kind of looking at things as a system, if we're talking grazing, looking at the system. Seems like too often we kind of pinpoint methane, and I'm getting oxide or carbon. So with methane, my understanding are, people like love hearing, but there's so much conservation dollars so from manure storage. But isn't methane only getting released when it's anaerobic versus aerobic, and even faster situation with more aerobic, and it kind of goes to carbon dioxide, which is low issue versus anaerobic in a big manure storage area, releasing a lot of methane. Was that part of your numbers here?
It's not part of my numbers, it's definitely part of what needs to be a life cycle analysis, but it's not my, and there's that, definitely, and if people look at that too, and what we need to do is get together. Put that together in life cycle analysis, what we need to write on manual law, including the soil microbiome, the root microbiome, there's so many moving parts.
Now, let's say it's really important. Just in terms, I work with a lot of content, but right now there's comments on climate smart, all the money that's coming through federal government. And we spend 51% of our equipment dollars on structural things and only 1% on soil health practices. This type of research can really influence if it's supposed to be climate smart conservation dollars. It really influences what we focus on. If we focus on soil, so we're going to cap all these manure storage structures, or overall the net impact of the system may not be so high if there are for the climate. So your research is really important. Yeah.
No, yeah, but we're really talking about what to know, what's safe and what people will do, the others, not, or will not be critical.
All right, thank you, everybody. My name's Tamie Veith. I'm actually an ag engineer. I'm also with USDA ARS. I have an office couple of doors down from Kathy. And I do a lot of work on natural resources. Usually the environmental aspects of what we put into farms. How can we keep it on the farm? How can we make it useful? How can we reduce outputs? In this case, we're going to talk about something that we didn't put on the farm with PFAS. So it is something I've been doing the last several years, and they asked me to talk about it. I wondered if you've all heard of it, if any of you heard of it, not heard of it, what you're thinking. Like the brief, what? Is it freaking you out or?
I've heard of it, I'm not exactly sure how. Trained our farm, I'm curious about ways it's getting out there, if it is.
Yeah, so it sounds like, so people have heard about it, they're kind of, okay, how did it get on my farm to start with? and what do I do? Why is it out there? All right, I think that we can probably hopefully get to. So it is in everything. It is in, I'd like to say it's a horrible thing. It's in Teflon, it's nonstick cooking, raincoats. Unfortunately, it's also in making the computer, the semiconductor chips for the computer, in your phones, in your pretty much everything. So I'd like to say everybody just stop using it, but kind of a problem. So just real quick, I'll show you more about it, but it started with this idea in the 1930s. It kind of mimics, there are natural compounds. And they do great, and so we're gonna do better, and so we did better. And we made these long chain production compounds, realized that was bad, changed the short chain, and eventually somebody realized it was a health hazard. And said, oh no, and that's about where we are now. We're like, oh no, farm, if it's on your farm, we wish that on people because it kind of shuts down the farm. But hopefully at the end of this, we'll figure out that for the most part, people shouldn't have to really worry, just be aware of it, not worry. For the most part, unless you happen to be one of those farms. So just a little bit of what on earth is this thing? They're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a broad class of chemicals. They consist of a long carbon that's bonded to fluorine. And fluorine bonds are strong. So the tail end is, this is my pointer on this thing. See that? Yep, there. All right, this tail of the compound is similar across all polyfluoroalkyl, but at different lengths, and then it attaches to other chemical pieces. And they all have some different properties. They can be short, they can be long. The long ones were the initial ones that were created. The PFAS that you've maybe heard of. People started to realize that was a problem. They replaced them with these shorter chain ones, thinking those were better. None of these will break easily. So I think it's kind of funny because they're kind of made to do things like, I mean, they have great chemical properties. They are stain resistant, water resistant. They are totally thermostable. They do not break down. They're good for firefighting foam. They de-ice your planes. They keep your carpets clean. They keep your food from sticking to your takeout containers. They're awesome, except for they don't go away. So you're stuck with them. Even though they're non-stick, you're really stuck with them. Yeah, so that'd be fine if they stuck to themselves, you know, if they just sort of minded their own business and I don't know, didn't bother anybody. But they will then reattach and they seem to be causing some issues. So that's the problem. What do we do? So I'm just going to show you a little bit about what we've seen in health concerns and then some studies and kind of farm related, what are we seeing? The main way they get into the humans are through ingestion or inhalation. And then the impacts on human health can vary. Depends on the type of PFAS, mostly kind of depends on if they're short chain, long chain, or now ultra short chain. On the dose, the amount, the duration, and characteristics. Just like with the animals, just like we've been talking about genetics and your environment and everything. The health risk research is a little early stage though. There's going to be a fair amount of literature out there, but a lot of the risk research is sort of just suggestive or it's not clear. And a lot of that is timing. I mean, I don't know, like Kathy was saying, you have a 5-week, 6-week study, you have a couple-year study, you know, what are you going to draw from that yet? We have found, it does seem pretty sufficient in the literature now that the PFOA and PFOS, they can cause lower birth rates, developmental delays, and some risk of kidney cancer and decreased vaccine effectiveness. So that there's enough to show that to really feel like those links are there. But that's not to say that the other people who are in situations where they've encountered a lot of PFAS, maybe have it in their blood, they have other health conditions. We just don't know enough about, you know, is it just because of that or is it because of other things? But it's there. So it matters. Since the long chain switched to mostly short chain around the 2000s, the blood levels in population, this is from the National Health Survey, blood samples across the US, the PFOS and PFOA levels have gone down a lot. So that's really good because they're not being made anymore and hopefully they're going down. That's not to say that the rest isn't in there. So what are we doing about this? I think governments are starting to get kind of serious and certainly community action. So we now have actually Pennsylvania, kind of happy because I'm from Pennsylvania, but they passed the state some drinking water standards. And then in 2022, and the EPA has just recently this year passed new drinking water standards, and all these are to be implemented in like 2009. So this is great. Except for the fact that actually analyzing for this. So here's a good number for you guys for the day. The only number you have to remember is 1 trillion. Because this is 4 drops in 1 trillion. Like 4 drops of water in 1 trillion drops of water, like the Olympic-sized swimming pool, that's like not much. It's kind of like hard to measure for, and it's just really not much, but that's not to say that that doesn't make a difference. So that's where kind of the problem is, it's kind of hard to capture and do something about stuff that's so small. Let's get to the question we're here for, how does it even get here? What, you guys didn't put PFAS, nobody fed PFAS, nobody, brings it in. It used to actually be somewhat like pesticides, but it's not, so nobody's doing it. It gets mostly in through wastewater discharge. And it's through industrial, like paper mills, all the semiconductors, all the industries who use it, who need it, or need parts of it to do all of their systems. It's in their wastewater. It's in wastewater treatment plants, cities, residential. It infiltrates either to the groundwater or into the stream or can run off. And treatment plants can't fully treat it out. It's just not, we haven't found ways yet. So if it's in there, it goes through there. So while they're treating other things, they haven't figured that one out yet. They're pretty widespread. So this treated water can be perfectly great to drink and everything, but they can't take the PFAS back out. These fluorine compounds are not going away. So this just shows, like for Pennsylvania as an example, it's kind of everywhere for different reasons. Through biosolid application, wastewater, just the water application, through industrial and Superfund sites, air emission, airports, municipal waste. So in terms of agriculture, for the most part, we think it's going to be on your lands because of probably wastewater reuse, either the 2 options are either through solids, biosolids applied from municipal waste or from industrial sites, not your barn, but actually biosolids, human related and treatment plants, or in the wastewater effluent that gets applied. It's going to be on there. Maybe it's been applied, maybe it was applied there years ago before anybody ever bought the farm, or or just now. And then now we have to figure out what to do about it. That's a major route. Then it gets either irrigated or applied, and it can wash off or everything. So here's 5 projects. I just want to kind of give you a little bit of feel for it, just to show you what we're finding. So we're going to look at it in irrigated wastewater, biosolid applied, just out in the networks, the water networks, and then some plant uptake. So this study is the Penn State Living Filter. Penn State actually has to land apply all of its wastewater onto this living filter. So the biosolids are landfill actually, but because they have too much copper. But all the wastewater effluent then gets land applied onto this. They've been doing it for 40+ years. There's no surface runoff. The groundwater going to the groundwater and it filters it. So that there are PFAS sources, students, a little bit of from the labs maybe, but mostly it's just what we could find anywhere. And then it goes through this sort of living filter situation, and in this study they looked at the human and health implications. If we look at it, so we basically sampled all these wells over time, and we saw that the PFAS, it goes up in the direction of the water. That's what goes up. I mean, none of this data that you're going to see is really surprising. it moves with the water, it moves with the soil. So when the PFAS levels are higher, there's less variability in them. And when they're lower, it's more variable, but actually overall, they're actually really low. But it's there, I mean, you can't say it's not there. And in terms of being in the soil, it seems to stay up on the higher in the profile for the most part. It doesn't seem to really move too much. I mean, if the water is really moving out. Lately, we've had really dry years. So that's also been influences, but it seems to be up in the upper parts. This land, who's familiar with it, but some of it's forested and some of it is forage. They use it for the animals in other parts of the university.
But why would they do that? I
Well,
already know it's bad.
they only know now that it's bad, but they didn't, it used to be totally fine.
All right.
See, that's the problem, is only in the last several years have we found that there's any of this. In terms of anything else, it's fine. It's got permitted for nitrate. It's good soil test. It actually looks really nice. It's green, it's healthy. Biosolids in general have a lot of other good benefits too. That's the other problem, is I don't really want to give the message of don't use biosolids. I mean, they, like manure, it has other benefits potentially. So, but it does have this drawback. In this case, with biosolids, we were partnered with a Carlisle wastewater treatment plant in Pennsylvania. And so this is wastewater effluent and biosolids from the whole sort of municipality of Carlisle Township. They have 3 farms that have received biosolids 1 to 3 times a year. Not every year, but I think some of the farms have had it like over a 10-year, 15-year history, but they only do it as appropriate based on the soil testing for the other compounds. They haven't tested for PFAS before. It's only recently that we've been able to really test for it, and it's not cheap. But we got involved with this study asking if the riparian buffers or the management practices that you're already putting on the farms to control nitrate and phosphorus from running off and soil erosion, if those can work for PFAS too. If so, great, and then nobody's coming out and saying, hey, can you have more management practices to keep your farm from adding, So we want to know how well that works. This is really in the early stages. I actually did just get back the data, but I haven't sent it back to the farm or to the project partner or the farmers. So I'm not going to show you any of it, but what I can say is it's actually low. It's all low, even though they've had the biosolids applied from this treatment plant that has municipal residential waste in it. There is PFAS in it, but it's all low. It's lower than the standards. I mean, there's no concern. Yeah.
Well, do you mean around the biosolids or around the
This is all the biosolids. They've only had the biosolids applied.
right?
This one. So it's low in, actually, I don't know that we tested their water. So the first study was wastewater effluent. And it's low enough. I mean, the living filters, they're probably gonna have to figure out how to make sure they stay under the guidelines with the wastewater effluent, but they also are applying all the wastewater effluent to the university nonstop, 365 days a year. It's all of it goes there. They don't really have an option right now to not apply it. They have to put it there. They don't have a holding tank. They don't have a store that has to go. This case, the farmers, I mean, they're agreeing to have the biosolids applied at a rate that's appropriate for, one's a horse pasture, one's a hay, cattle, I think, and, the other one. But, you know, they're agreeing to it at the rate supplied. The biosolid levels aren't high, but on the farm with the soil tests on the farm are fine. So far, it's also been really dry, so, yeah.
So do you, I guess two questions. One is, you're talking about the solid and bottom, right? So in this situation, this farm application, is this the water or is this solid?
Yeah, so the question is, what am I meaning by biosolids? Is it both soil solids and water? So water reuse is the water part. In this case, the biosolids application is just the solids.
And in addition to that, so what's the explanation? I grew up in New England and following pretty closely what's going on in the game. Why is it different here in this situation than what you're dealing with up there?
So why are the situation here better or different than what's the situation in Maine? Also Michigan, and Maine has a lot of paper mills. It's the industrial waste, I think. Industrial waste service. I mean, if you do look at data and you see really high numbers, look to see where, because the industrial numbers that I've seen are high, like magnitudes higher, like 1,000 versus 30 or 10.
The very smooth processing waste falling, because there's a lot of land application, food processing.
This, so I would say it falls in with the residential municipal. I haven't run into a situation where I've seen that there's a huge problem with that. The problems I've encountered are the industrial from the manufacturing of non-food.
You have water bottles and other containers and a lot of the food processing waste that's going in the digest, which is coming from the food warehouses and the deep packages, they're just smashing them and then it flows out.
Yeah, and it's not that it's not in there, that's so, yeah, I mean, it is in the plastics and all. So, yeah.
Have you looked at, I know it's in the soil and in the water, have you looked at it in the plants, and the cattle that come off those fields?
So we have a question about whether we've looked at it in the cattle and in the plants. This last project, which won't be so satisfying, honestly, to you guys, is that we have looked at it in hemp uptake with the idea that maybe hemp could substitute for, that it would uptake it better and kind of clean off fields where there's too much PFAS in the soil. So it's replacing from corn or something. And then you would use that plant in a non-livestock food way, you know, to get soil cleaned up. You would use it for,
Give it to the people who smoke.
you would have very non-stick clothing, you would, you know, whatever, but you know, that would be a good substitute. This study, I can tell you this, but it'll be it's preliminary findings. They didn't really find it much yet, but other people have worked on it. So that work is being done and a lot in the central park. There are a lot of people who worked on how much it uptakes in plants, exactly how, where, what, if it's the grain or the, you know, the plant, or, you know, which parts uptake it. And then what we can do and how it goes through the animal.
We're not shooting the mess. If we sound a little drunk.
No, it's not, I mean,
PFAS,
these
you know.
are valid, I mean, yeah, I mean, that, we're trying to do this as fast as we can because it's a problem, you know?
Do we know if it's bioconcentrated, if the cow eats a lot of it? At low values, as
Well, it
doesn't,
concentrate, yeah.
that is, they might, the levels in the plants or in the forest may be low, but
Yeah,
a cow eats a lot of forage, and if it doesn't, what are the mechanisms for release of this? Does it stay in the body a lot? Does it?
yeah, I think so the question is like, is it bioaccumulating like in the cow or is it releasing? I'm not the expert on that. There are some studies on that. We can certainly try to, you know, keep you guys informed and get information out. I'm going to say I don't really think so. Too much, not in an extreme way because it goes back out in the manure, in the milk, in the air in the, it kind of, I won't say it balances itself out, but it's not just being absorbed. But it does accumulate through the food chain.
I was just gonna say to that point, I know there's one area that invasive melted a lot this year, they were able to clear. They were, their land actually didn't have PFAS on it.
Yeah.
And they weren't able to clear the other side of the mill, they were able to clear out, but like the cows didn't actually start testing negative. It was not needed. It took them months.
Yeah, you have to
And
have,
so it didn't like hang around forever, but once they stopped eating.
yeah, so there was a comment about a farm in Maine that had, they had it in the hay that they're feeding the cattle, and eventually they fed clean hay. It didn't clean out, and that's what they were trying with the farmers in Maine is to say, well, you can't feed them something that's not on off your land, because that's where the PFAS is. The problem is the logistics and the economics of all of that, but yeah, that's really good discussion. So let me just show you this, the study about this groundwater. This is Pennsylvania. But we assessed, we have like a master well owner network. It's kind of a group of citizen scientists who will go out and monitor their wells and monitor nearby and are interested in well water, because so much of Pennsylvania is on well water. And so we went out and recruited some of those. We focused on the people that were in counties where biosolids were applied. So this would be the humor, again, we're not talking manure, but we're talking the wastewater treatment plants, the biosolids, the solids themselves being applied. We asked those well owner residents. And then the first couple of years, and the third year, we selected counties based on cancer risks across the state, partly because there was interest from and funding from the grant from cancer group to look at if that was an issue. We sent them all the sampling kits, the instructions, how to do it, or to send it back. And it's interesting when we do these because the signups go so fast. Will anybody do it? Who wants to go out and take a water sample and bring it and send it back? You have to mail some. They sign up so fast. So it's so nice to see people so interested in. And so I have a number of just charts. It's not really critical about it, but just to show you that, again, it's there. The PFOA, this is one of the long chain. It's there. It's not everywhere because we didn't sample everywhere. We sampled the counties that have biosolids applied. So you can see dots where there was a sample at all. But you can see it was detected in 39% of the samples that were fed out. But 2% of them were above this 14 nanograms and 12 above the 4. And down here is like Lancaster, it's like really intensive. Everything. I'd say livestock, but also industry, and that's starting to get where there's a lot of population density. PFOS, the same thing, another long chain. Then this is one of the short chain kind of replacements, and it was never above the EPA. Kind of just this one pop up right here. These are single samples. For anybody's gonna like say jump on this, you're gonna go out and take another sample, and maybe it was a fluke. We did send out field ones, so we think these are good data, but they change. They change even from week to week. There's another short chain, and then another one. So you see they're all kind of around the same area. But even then, the number that were above the limit in the well water is 0.5%. So then looking, this is more working off my research from the past is, okay, well, is it out in the stream? Is it out running off of the farms and the lands? And what do the farms see? So we're working in a watershed that's, cold water, high quality trout stream. It's impaired for sediment already, which is part of why we're looking at it. It's close to us, has a great fruit farm, but it's impaired for sediment. There's a partnership of waters of people working in it, and landowners, people interested. So we've gone out and among other things, we've sampled in the watershed, with primary focus of getting differences in sediment before and after they've restored stream embankments and added other management practices. I mean, they've just gone out there and tried to really improve this watershed. We're getting sediment before and after, nutrients, PFAS and pesticides. When we get the PFAS, it's in the grab samples, so it's going to grab water out of the stream. Or we put it in the, we put these membranes into the stream, leave them for 2 weeks and come back and take them, analyze that, we put new ones in, and leave them for 2 weeks. So it gets more of that, sort of the chronic nature of what's in there, what would be kind of getting onto the amphibians and the, you know, that kind of, what's getting into that semi-permeable membranes. But I'm just gonna show you the grab samples right now, partly because these other ones are a little bit more work to analyze. But I think that they're gonna be somewhat similar. So the grab samples, it's every 2 weeks, I just averaged it by month because it's a lot easier to see. But in cases where there were 2 samples per month, they weren't widely different. So you can see it varies. These are 6 different sites within the watershed. And yeah, it varies all over. Actually, there could be some pattern to it, but the reality is even at its highest, it's 1 nanogram per liter. And we need to hit less than 4 for drinking water standard. And here again, 1.6. This one's up to 4.5, but this standard happens to be 10. And this is one of the short chain. It's a little bit, I don't know, I guess I don't want to say it degrades faster because it doesn't degrade, but it's a shorter chain. This one, the guideline is 2,000, so we're well under it. So yeah, it's not that it's not in the stream. And when we go out there, we're doing everything we can to do quality samples and quality control in the lab and in the field and everywhere else. But it's very low. That's reassuring. And then just quickly the plant, the hemp study that we mentioned earlier, hemp uptake varied a lot across the varieties. And it didn't accumulate well here with the 5 chemicals, but other studies have seen it accumulate, and certainly we've seen it it accumulates into the leaves more than the grains, in some of the haze. So it does pull up out of the soil. Yeah.
The lobby is called.
Yeah. Not really. I mean, they're working with this sort of limited data as well. I mean, that's the problem, is that we don't have that much data, so they're working with the best scientists, well, the data they have. But they're having to actually regulate. I mean, we're like, so the rest of us are trying to jump, as scientists, like jump on it beforehand, so we can figure it out, so we can give them the best informed data we can, and hopefully inform them. But I was sort of surprised when this dropped, it was like 70 nanograms per liter, dropped to 4. Like, we have to measure that? That's little.
I'm just wondering if in the street study, you did it one season and have you of discharge? Because if it's 4 nanograms on a grab, how much is coming off the watershed
Yeah.
in the stream? Is it milligrams? Is it pounds? I
Um,
can say kilograms. I guess, but-
yeah, good question. So the astute audience will note that I neglected to tell you about the discharge from these streams. So yes, I give you concentrations. We do have discharge. I actually haven't, that's part of problem with the farming membranes too. It's harder to get the flow for that. We do have it. I need to analyze it all. These are small streams. The flow rate is usually it's never really above 2 feet per second. Even when there's a lot of high stream volume, I think the numbers are lower, but actually in the last 2 weeks, I've sent my person out. So we're trying to get at some of that because I think it's more in the ground flow, in the base flow coming probably from septic tanks in this watershed. I'm like, what? There's no industry, there's no paper mills, there's no, where did this come from? It didn't come from the farm, it didn't come from the cows. So septic tanks, I think mostly. So I want to see if it's in the groundwater coming through into the recharge, or if when it storms, there really shouldn't be anything.
So you haven't looked at the rising wind and the falling wind just in baseball?
Water wise, yes, but in terms of the PFAS concentration, no, because and we're gonna try to get at that a little bit, but part of the problem is that each one of these samples is $240 cheap. I mean, that's the cheap version. We are going to, he did go out and collect samples, and he's trying to get them during the storms without risking his own safety too much, but like to get them during. And if we could do, for nutrients, we do an automated sampler. So we can do it flow weighted and we can get a rising limit all throughout. But you're supposed so for PFAS, it needs to be in a certain kind of plastic bottle, not glass bottle, but not necessarily the kind that the flow, the auto sampler works, and you have to use a different kind of glove and a different kind of, and a different kind of, so between the 3 kinds we have, it's hilarious. I'm like, make sure you use the latex for this, the nitrile for this, the HDPE for this, glass for this, okay, and go collect the flow weighted, but don't use that tubing. Like, what tubing am I supposed to use? Well, I don't know, but it's not that one. I mean, it's already in there. Some studies are coming out where lab techs are trying to analyze this. To at least let us know how much is in there. Every time they do the analysis, there's actually potentially PFAS in the bottles that they sample, the membranes, the solution, the sorbent. So if we can get a handle on what level, we can at least, maybe we can use some of those and look over it, you know, and then start to get this. Because that is the question really to me right now. What's in the rising and falling women? Where is it in the stream or base flow?
Well, there are a lot of that. What's
Then-
happening in the soil?
Yeah, so we can know where it's coming from exactly. The good news is the USDA is taking action in terms of, we just held a 3-day workshop to really try to pull together people and figure out a lot of these questions you guys have been asking. What's going on? Where is it? What do people need to know? What do they want to know? What can we solve? What is even reasonable? What are the short-term questions we can ask? What are the long-term? Okay, who's going to do it? So we weren't trying to necessarily solve those questions, but like, who's in charge, who's doing it, who's taking that one on, who's taking that one on? To try to get these questions to people so that they can develop some good guidelines. The states, I'm happy to see are taking more action. Some of them were kind of waiting, I think, got EPA to guide them. But New Hampshire, it's like monitoring and treatment levels. Maine is prohibited application. Michigan and Maryland now is limiting their land application. And then I think this is a question we've talked about a little bit already, is that Maryland and like 11 other states have prohibited any additional PFAS intentionally being added. Sounds kind of weird, like why would you add it? But added to like food packaging, firefighting foam, the carpets, don't add it just to keep things from being stained for it, just to be nice, kind of, but. So it still will be in some of the other industries where really don't know, I think, how to make these things without melting everything down. But wherever we can, wherever it's kind of a luxury, I think it's getting prohibitive. And that will really help a lot. And that actually was my last slide, except the acknowledgements. A whole lot of people, as you can see, go into doing this. So I really appreciate them, and they're on the back of the slide. If anybody, I guess, has questions and wants to reach out. I probably don't know most of the answers, but I can try to, I can try to direct you to the right person, try to help out. Yeah.
Two questions. Is there any technology to remove it from well water?
There, people are actively working on that. I would say more people are working on that and how to bind it. So the question is how, or is technology, to remove it from well water? I'd say more people are working on that and binding it and trying to actually maybe degrade it or microbiologically change it than the kinds of things about what's out there. But it is, and there is some that's, I think, been useful for the ultra short chains. So I think people are trying to figure it out and maybe getting some of it. But some of it, I think, is just there, honestly, but yeah.
What about whey? So we have a combined plant. Would there be some, packaging into the whey, because the whey is getting land applied. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of whey getting that applied in front of them.
yeah, so he's asked, there's a question about if the whey that's getting applied on farmland, if that's an issue. I mean, again, I'm not the expert on, I haven't measured that, but my gut feeling is that there's no more in the whey than was in the whey, in the milk from the animals, it's so. The more that in all the packaging it's prohibited, that it's not added to the containers and then the less is gonna get through there. So I would think that would be a low source. I think that one slide I didn't show you guys, but my extension person, Faith Dubuye, she's in Pitt State. She's been really reaching out to people on this and trying to provide what information she does know. And she's happy to try to find answers and look things up. And so she also encourages, like, so if you have these questions, especially on your land, find out if you've had biosolids applied, find out if you think the whey is a problem, and see if you can get testing. If not, before just losing total sleep, see if it's even high. But go ahead and look so that you're informed before anybody else comes to you. We have more time for more questions. I think we're running out of time.
Thank you so much. These have been great.
So my name is Leanna Duppstadt. I am an agronomy educator with Penn State Extension. I'm based out of Bedford County, Pennsylvania, but I work with kind of that south central region. And so I was asked to talk today about bale grazing. And so has anybody heard of bale grazing before? We know what it is. Okay, so good. We're off to a good starting point there. So basically what we're doing is replacing bales into our pastures so that we can utilize them for winter feeding. This was a lot of this information. It was first adopted in Canada, Great Plains. And the reason for that being why it was so quickly adopted there is because they get winters where they freeze solid, right? Now in a lot of areas of the Northeast and other areas as we move further south, we might not quite have that scenario. And so what I'm going to try and talk about today is how we can make it work for us, right? Because we don't quite have the same conditions. It's going to be like we do with any sort of farming scenario where we're gonna make it work for what we have, right? All right, so these are some of the main reasons why we would introduce bale grazing into our systems, and I will break these down a little bit further, but we want to distribute those nutrients throughout our fields. We're gonna have improved forage production. We're gonna try and reduce our labor input and costs, potentially reduce the need for any of our sacrifice areas or feeding pads, things like that, improve livestock health, and increase our water holding capacity and water quality in our surrounding area. So first, distribution of nutrients. If we're out there feeding animals on our pastures during the winter, rather than having them on a feeding pad, concentrated feeding area, we're putting those nutrients out where we need them. We're reducing the fact that we have to then move that manure to other places. So 50 to 90% of nutrients is excreted in the manure, and we're going to really want to capitalize on utilizing that. So some research or parts of research have been done, analysis have been done on looking at hay bales and the content within them. So this was just one single example where we're looking at crude protein, phosphorus, and potassium of a single bale. And this was a 1,000-pound bale, and down here across the bottom, it was converted into dry matter basis. So you can see here that we have quantity of fertilizer in terms of nitrogen, P2O5, and K2O. Which gives us the percent of nutrient that's been recycled. So we've got 50% here for our nitrogen, which is fairly typical, and then 85% for our phosphorus and potassium. So it's within that 50 to 90% range. Basically, when you do all the math for that on how much of a fertilizer value can be, these are old numbers from 2018, so these don't take this for real. These numbers would be much higher if we look at today's numbers. But basically giving us the idea here that at $20 in fertilizer value for hay that sells for $40 to $60 per bale, depending on where you are, we're between 30 and 50% of that being the overall value of the hay. So we're getting a lot of fertilizer value for the amount of hay. Yeah.
So is that the bale itself, or what is measured coming out of the backside?
Backside.
So that is the backside.
So we're looking at the nutritive value of the bale. And then we're taking that from a dry matter basis and then a percentage excreted.
Okay, great,
Yep.
thank you.
All right, the next thing we're gonna talk about is improved forage production. So the more nutrients we have coming out on the field, the more growth we're gonna have. And I'll break these down even further when we start talking about, so the way I should explain in the beginning. The way I have this presentation broken out is what it is, why we would do it, how we would do it, and then is it worth it? And so we're gonna stepwise move through this on all of the benefits and also some of the cons that we might see. So improved forage production, obviously we've got more nutrients being put out here on the field for us. We're gonna get some better growth over those forages over time. We may also see some decreased weed pressure. I've got a picture of broom sedge here. A lot of farmer reports have been that they've seen a decrease in the amount of broom sedge. It's a very good indicator of poor fertility. So if we're starting to increase our fertility with bale grazing, we're going to start to see that decline. Something that you should think about though is planning for possibly reseeding, particularly just right where the bale was sitting. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along here. Improved water capacity and quality. So as we're utilizing these bales, we're increasing our organic matter, and I've got some research a little later on. And when we're increasing our organic matter, we're also increasing our water holding capacity of those soils. We're able to hold more moisture in there. Now, this does take time to build up. So this isn't a one and done type of scenario. It's multiple years of building that organic matter. Also, just having that additional residue in general. So if we have more material on the surface, we talk about this when we talk about crop forming. More residue left there, the more water we're able to slow down our capture, and so that we have less runoff into our streams. So being able to hold any excess nutrients and keep them in place where we want them to be. So this would give us cleaner water in nearby ponds and streams, more overall nutrient retention, and also slower moisture evaporation. So we may have a scenario where we've got an overgrazed situation, but we're going to bale graze in that area to try and hold the moisture in, less evaporation happening over time. Eliminating feeding areas and reducing labor. So potentially replacing the need for permanent sacrifice areas, feeding pads, or having to feed inside. And basically this gives us the ability to not haul manure anymore. This isn't going to be the case all the time for our particular situation, because we may have those days where it's a little bit warmer in the winter time. It's kind of muddy and mucky outside. We don't want to do a lot of damage to our pastures. So we may have to still bring them inside at some point in time. But the more we can keep them outside, the less work we have to do in that case. No daily placement of hay. So I know we're in a grazing group, but I also know that we can't graze entirely year round, right? So how many times a day are people going out and placing bales? Once a day, twice a day, every couple of days, right? So if I already have all of my bales lined up here, I don't have to go out and do that. The only thing I have to do is go out and do some fencing. I'm not trying to start a tractor in the winter time, which we know can be a lot of kicking the butt. I've got a lot of old tractors on our farm, so every once in a while they're kind of persnickety and they don't want to start when it's cold. So if I don't have to start it and all I have to do is move the fence around, that's a much better scenario. If you do have a lot of snow for some reason, you start moving up into the further the northeast, you're not trying to plow a path so that you can get the bale out there, right? Reducing damage to fields. I have a specific spot through our field that has ruts in it because it is wet and muddy and I'm trying not to damage the whole field. So I'm kind of using that same laneway the whole time, but it's a mess sometimes. It's slippery and then I have to go through and try and level that out. We've got to reseed it, let it rest. And so trying to reduce damage to fields because we're not moving equipment whenever the conditions might not be ideal. So if we're not wanting to go out and plant in the spring when it's wet and muddy because we don't want our equipment out there, we also don't want to do the same things to our pasture, right? Improving livestock health. So, and I'm talking about this in terms of standing in less mud and manure, right? So whenever we typically have these bale rings, around that ring up to like 10 feet out, it is just a muddy mess, right? And where do the calves like to lay down? Right here, right? And so they're laying there in that mud too. So we would have less contaminated feed because it's not laying in all this mud. This is a much cleaner area. They're not standing in mud. I will say too, this bottom picture, of course, was it had dried up a little bit, but normally they would be up to their knees standing in that. Less matted hair, so they have better insulating ability. Less foot issues because their feet they're not standing wet. And then reduce avian infections in calves that want to lay in those less than ideal locations. Something else that can help in this scenario is creep feeding fall calves, and I might say this another time later on. But when you're setting your lines for your bale grazing, having it high enough so that calves can creep under there and maybe get to some feed before the bigger cows do. All right, so how do we do this? When we're choosing a field, we're going to want to choose one of our low fertility fields. You're going to see the biggest impact on your lower fertility areas. So something like this, where we've got a lot of the brood sedge happening, right? Also maybe an area with low organic matter, or something that needs reseeded. And so for like this example in here, you could also pick something hilly. Didn't have that listed there, but a hilly area where you can't always get tractors onto. Just having your bales all set up there. So an example like this one, this slope right here is between 15 and 20%. It was farmed up and down the hill. So all of the topsoil is over here somewhere, but not here. So it needs some of that organic matter added to it. It's clearly low fertility with a lot of our brood sedge happening, and it's steep. It's hard to get equipment on to place a bale all the time, especially in less than ideal conditions. So this would be a good field to use for something like that. And it is starting to look sparse, needs reseeded, so we could bale graze it heavily and graze the grass there heavily, and we could reseed it in the spring. Stockpile pasture. I have a little asterisk here because for areas where it doesn't freeze hard for long periods within the winter, stockpile areas may be a better scenario for you because you have more forage biomass there. Stability of your soil is a little bit better. And so when you start having that hoof traffic in some of the like softer conditions, you're doing a little bit less damage to that soil. So utilizing a stockpile pasture and having that extra feed in there, extra grass biomass to help hold the soil in place. Placing less bales per acre, I'll talk about that more. so that you're not having such repetitive foot traffic in those spaces. That also is really helpful for the creep feeding of the calves because they can get under, eat the grass that's there. And then you can move big cows in, moms in, and they'll start eating, they'll eat what grass is left that the calves can get to. But then they can eat the bales that are there. We want to make sure we're avoiding environmentally sensitive areas, and that's just a fancy way of saying, please don't put it near streams, ponds, places where it's going to flood. We don't want to have any sort of, we're going to have a lot of manure deposition in those areas. We don't want to have that kind of runoff for any reason into those environmentally sensitive areas. And one of the parts that can be really challenging with any sort of rotational grazing system is we got to have a water source. And during the winter time, we need to have a frost-free water source because nobody likes to go out and chip water or try and thaw out frozen hoses, right? So this may be a pretty big caveat for some people. We may need to utilize areas closer to our frost-free water sources. So we're going to set up fields in late fall or early winter when we're a little bit drier, our soil is a little bit sturdier, it's firm. And so here's just our example field. We've got a water source for this field, so we're ready to go. And we're going to start laying bales out. And we're going to do it in a checkerboard pattern so that you can kind of maximize the amount of area. And then when you come back through the next year, you would not place a bale where you had another one. You would offset them. And so you can kind of keep going back and forth with that pattern and get them more spread out over several years. If you're doing this for the first time, it's recommended to only do it with 1/4 to 1/3 of your winter hay needs. When we're always recommending something new, we say start small, right? Give yourself a chance to get used to it, understand how it works for you, what you need to do. You don't want to get into it and realize this isn't working, but I have this all set up ready to go and I've done it with the whole thing. So start small, figure out how it's going to work for you, and then you can expand on it as you realize what your hay needs for winter are going to be. So in the eastern US, where we don't have those frozen solid winters, 3 to 6 bales per acre or up to two tons when you're starting, so that we don't have too much food traffic in one area and cause too much damage. Now, up in the north and Great Plains, they're putting 10 or more bales to the acre. They're keeping it pretty darn dense. And so you'll see later some research that shows just how much that nutrient kind of increases. And so theirs will be a little bit higher, but ours will be more spread out. All right, after we get all of our bales set up, we're going to put up our temporary fencing. And so we've got our water source here. We're going to move away from the water source and we're going to get our temporary fencing set up. And you're going to want to set up, so each row about 30 to 90 feet from the previous one. Our bales are at least 40 to 50 feet apart. Now that could be more when we're putting less bales on the acre, but we want them at least that far apart. So we've got this nice distribution of manure around each bale. So we're going to want to set up at least 2 or 3 sets of grazing sessions. The reason I say that is, I mean, you can be ahead of yourself and it's nice, but if for some reason this strand fails, whether a cow pushes it down, a deer knocks it down, a tree falls down on it, something, your cows are not getting into whole plants. Because cows are stinkers or sheep, any of them, they're going to go clear to the other side of this field, nibble on each bale and make a mess. And so this kind of saves yourself a little bit so that they're only getting so far. And another thing that you can do, even if we don't have grazing conditions, the ground is still sometimes dry and hard, it's a pain to push the posts in. You could put all of your temporary posts in ahead of time, so all you have to do is move the line. We don't need a back fence during the dormant season, so as you take these down, you can just leave them down, they can get back to their water source. Rotate every 1 to 7 days, so take that into consideration on how many bales you need to feed your cows for roughly that long. Decreasing the amount of days if we have some bad weather conditions, where it's a little bit softer. And the reason for that is just so you minimize the amount of foot traffic, how long you're in that space. We want to optimize our residue cover, and that means we want to have enough residue there that we're getting Some of that organic matter put back on. We're getting it from the manure too, but we're also getting it from any of that leftover hay. But you don't want to leave too much that you're smothering out a very large section of pasture, right? And so one of the recommendations we can make is to try and use some high quality bales, so they're more interested in eating it, and they don't leave quite as much behind. It will be a balancing act and something that is an art and a science. So something that you'll have to pay attention to, and monitor for a little while until you see how many days that hay really does last them, based on how much residue you would like to leave behind. Bale feeders or bale rings, whatever you want to call them, are optional. If you are not using rings, we start to decrease the amount of days that you let them in there. We can mix wet and dry bales. So this is something that you can do with your dry bales, or if you've got baleage done, you can use that as well. Typically what you want to do there is to, I've heard two different ways. I've heard people do a row dry, a row wet, a row dry, a row wet, simply so that they're not leaving things behind, because they'll want to, most of the time they'll want to go to the wet bales first and then go back to the dry bales. But I've also heard of people doing alternate in the same row, dry, wet, dry. They'll eat the wet first, then they'll go to the dry when they're done. So either scenario would kind of work. Really just play with what your livestock prefer and what seems to work best, so you could try it too. Go ahead.
Our area, they use a lot of.
Are very using a lot of the plastic netting. And so if it's winter and the bales are wet and then it's frozen, does the netting come off all right? Does the folks have any experience with that? Twine I can see getting off. I mean, it might be frozen on, but the netting wrap I can see being a nightmare if you're trying to do that. So would you unwrap your bales before the season and just bring all that plastic in out of the field?
I've heard it both ways. If you've got baleage, obviously we're not unwrapping those first, we're gonna expose them. If you've got a dry wrapped bale, you can do it either way. I've heard both. I have heard struggle. I don't have any good
I was just
recipes.
thinking if they're so heavy now, I gotta get a tractor out
Correct.
there to move them, because I can't get them unfrozen.
Correct, yes, and I've heard it both ways. Just understanding that once you take off the net wrap or the twine, you loosen the bale, you decrease its water shedding ability a little bit as it starts to soften. I have heard it both ways, and I'm sorry, I don't have a good recommendation on, yeah, how to fix that problem. That's just one of those things you have to adapt with. Okay. Oh, I can slightly add to that, is when you're storing them on their side like that, depending on the size of your round bale, and if it is frozen to the ground, flipping it up onto its round side so that you can a little bit easier try and roll the circle around it and get the twine and everything off. Even being able to utilize a four-wheeler to put strap around and flip it up rather than getting the tractor out is better in that respect. Slightly less on gas, much lighter and easier on the pasture. All right, so is it worth it? We've reached that step here. So in terms of hay quality decline, because we are now leaving our round bales outside, right? So the number one thing is to store our bales inside or wrapped or covered in some way to try and keep our quality where we want it to be. So we just have to keep this in the back of our mind, is that we may have some dry matter losses since we're storing them outside. Something that I would recommend, I've heard two different ways for this type of setup. I've had some people who are baling it, they take it straight out to the pastures and put them out there and they're ready to go. Other folks who bring them back to their facility, store them inside until a little bit closer to when they would want to start utilizing them for the winter. Before we would start to get some softer soil in the chips. Just understanding that we may have some dry matter losses, there may be some mold on the exteriors of the bales. In terms of acid treatments, a lot of times those can help for indoor storage conditions, but when you start looking at the research of bales being stored outside, there's really no difference. So now you've wasted the cost of the acid treatment and some wear and tear on your equipment because it's acid that's right there. Considering too that as we start to get those cooler temperatures, we have lower biological activity, so less is less of a concern with some of these molds if you wait till we start to get kind of a lot cooler outdoors. Crude protein content, can decline a little bit, but it's not typically, changed quite as much with weather conditions as compared to our soluble carbohydrates, which start to decline. Also considering some reduced palatability, mostly on that exterior portion of the bale that's been exposed to weather. So this was a, whoops, I added something as I was sitting back there, but my slide was already up here. So, looking at this piece of information here, this was showing the losses of forage quality during storage, indoors and outdoors, so weathered and unweathered. And so you can see here, just looking at the grass hay unweathered, we've got crude protein at 13.5% and weathered is at 16.4%. So total crude protein will decline. Percentage of crude protein might look like it increases, but that's because there were dry matter losses. So you have less material, so the percentage looks like it went up. However, if we're looking at digestible dry matter, you can see very clearly that that drops, and it drops even more sharply with our legumes. So maintaining bale quality, making tight, dense bales, they have that thatching effect. If you've ever heard about thatched roofs and how well they shed water, the tighter and denser you can make those bales, the better the thatching effect. So fine leafy stems, weed free. You get those weeds in there, they're those thicker stems, they're not weaving and intertwining quite as nicely. This is a trickier thing to do with dried warm season annuals because they have those thicker stems. So if you're wanting to use warm season annuals, a wrapped bale would be a lot easier. It's also easier that way anyway, because we know it would be a challenge to make dry warm season annual hay. For water wicking purposes, net wrap tends to be a little bit better if you want to use, if you're using twine or decrease the size, the distance in your twine. Now, that does make that caveat there though, where it's going to be even harder to unwrap it if it is frozen, because that is a lot of peeling it off of the bale. So that's a consideration as well. They also make things called bale caps, but that can be kind of expensive. It's basically just plastic that lays over the top of the bale and has little pins that you stick in. But that can be expensive depending on how many bales of hay you have laying out. So basically, just storing bales covered for as long as possible, waiting until storing them inside until closer to when you're going to want them for bale grazing during the winter. All right, improved animal health. We jumped into the, we're in the is it worth it section. Improved animal health. So I talked about less issues with mud, pre-feeding the fall calves. Something you have to think about in terms of animal health as well, though, is any adverse weather conditions. Cows and other livestock will do well in most adverse weather conditions unless it is cold, wet, and windy, right? So we may have those scenarios there where we need to provide some sort of external shelter that they would be able to utilize, whether they have the ability to come back to the barn during that really bad weather, whether we're putting up a windbreak or at least putting them in a pasture that has a row of trees. We may struggle a little bit. A lot of times folks in the North or Great Plains, they have enough bales there in our mind that kind of serve as their own windbreak. But we may not have bales in that high enough of a density to be able to shield all of our livestock in that field. So just something to keep in mind. One of the reasons we do this on smaller acres of land is because we need to learn what fields are, now we might know to an extent, but what fields are going to be worse for us in certain periods of time or certain periods of weather. Don't get into the idea that I have this set rotation. I want to go from here to here to here to here. Being able to adapt if we have some of those conditions that this area wants to sit a little bit wet, it's not quite conducive to what we have right now. I'm going to jump them around and move them over here. You may need to move some fencing around, make sure that they can still access water. And during those periods of warm weather, don't constrict cattle to small areas. That's when you get too much of that pressure in a small space and start to create mud on ground. All right, this was some research looking at animal performance and cost. So the difference between moderate gain and high gain, so that's maybe not 100% relevant in this scenario, but this is the way they had this set up. They had moderate gain, which was 55% of mature body weight, and high gain, which was 62% of mature body weight, how much they were trying to get them to. And so we did that with bale grazing and dry lot. I say we, not me, somebody else's. But they did this with bale grazing and dry lots in both scenarios. And so what they were able to show was about a $60 per head cost savings by doing the bale grazing as opposed to the dry lot. And also though, whenever you only do a moderate gain as opposed to a high gain, with no differences in calving for first or second calves. So there was a cost savings whenever you switch from a dry lot scenario to a bale grazing. Soil health benefits. So reducing or eliminating the need for commercial fertilizer. Up to a point, we may still need to do some soil tests, see what we need. But as we keep doing this over time and increasing that fertility, we can maybe start to eliminate some of those needs. So this was some research done in Canada. There is not a lot of research in general about the retained nutrients from bale grazing with traditional hay feeding. Yes.
Can I give you a case study?
Yes, I would love that.
Over 30 years of bale grazing, I've maintained the soil fertility without added fertilizer.
Okay. Yep. And I've heard a lot of situations like that from folks. There's not a lot of it that's like published and written somewhere. Is it? Okay.
It's on our website.
Okay. Okay. So there is some out there, and occasionally though it's hard to find, but this was one of them that was done in Canada. And what they found was looking at bale grazing versus traditional hay feeding. And so they had bale grazing on a set number of acres. They also had cows in a dry lot scenario, and then they took that manure and spread it on a field with the same acreage as the bale grazing. Okay. And so what they found was that the inorganic nitrogen was 187% higher. The extractable potassium 185% higher. The phosphorus levels were nearly identical. That makes sense because phosphorus is fairly stable in a bed pack setting. So, and then they saw that the forage growth the next year was 127% higher, and protein levels were 74% higher. These numbers seem very, very high. And that is because this was done in Canada on a very small acreage with a lot of bales in one space. Whereas the way we're going to be doing it is we're going to have less bales on more acres. So when they're doing it, they're putting all of their winter feed needs on 5 to 10% of their pastures. We're doing it on more between 30 and 50%. So this is still happening, but on a more spread out area. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, increased organic matter. So we like improving organic matter. It helps improve mineralization of nutrients like nitrogen. It improves the water holding capacity. More fertility means more forage, means more root production. So looking at this image right here with these soil pores, continuous grazing is this one right here on the left. So we can see less roots overall, and also a very hard clay pan with no root penetration below that. Whereas for rotational grazing alone, we've got more porous structure. We still have this little bit of a hard pan here, but there are moments here where you can see the roots have gone through it a lot more than our continuous system. And then we've got rotational grazing and bale grazing combined here in the center. Overall, comparing them, much darker soil, more porous structure, more roots and earthworms, and that hard pan is gone. So you can see how that changes our soils. This is just a fun image here. Penn State Extension last year kind of got involved with the Soil Your Undies campaign, where you basically buried a pair of cotton underwear. So if you want to know how much microbial activity and everything and how healthy your soils are, buy a pair of cotton underwear, bury it, and dig it up 60 days later and see what it looks like. So that's always a fun thing to try and do on your own. The only thing you have to pay attention to for soil health benefit reasons, hoof traffic, and any of that hugging that might happen in wet conditions. We're kind of ripping up the roots when we're walking on it. So, to hit home with that, soil organic matter and soil moisture content, cuts it off just a tiny bit, but there were 2 sites in this study. So there's site 1 up here, site 2, and we can see years 1, 2, and 3. And so looking down here at soil organic matter, year 1, 2, and 3, you can see how that increases. Our organic matter is increasing. It does the same thing over here at site 2. And our soil moisture content, because our organic matter has gone up, our water holding capacity has increased. That also increases as we go from year 1 to year 3 in both of these situations. Okay, not this one right here. Pasture changes. So there may be some things that we have to watch out for, some improvements we might have to make. I've seen differences in research between what they see in the first year, and I'll explain that here. So for this particular one, they did not see improved forage amounts. They actually saw a 68% decrease in dry matter that first growing season. I've seen other research that have said they've seen almost the exact opposite, and they've seen an increased amount in the first growing season. I've also seen it more often said that the second year is when you're really going to see that forage improvement, because you do that first year have a lot of this area here where that's that leftover hay. It needs to break down a little bit further, and then the second year you'll see a lot more of an uptick of forage production. Everywhere though, right here where the bale was sitting and around it, increases in crude protein, phosphorus, and potassium. We will have to watch out for weed pressure. Of course, now we have some bare areas where our grass is potentially being smothered. Weeds are really adventitious, and so they may start to creep in. In some scenarios, the livestock may go, weeds green up fairly quickly, and so they may go in and graze those first and very hard. And so we might not have any residual effects, but you'll have to watch out for that. And there also may need to be scenarios where you simply need to reseed or spread a little bit of seed in that space to help leaf up a little bit. So this was some research showing changes in dry matter amounts over the years. And so you can see here at site 1 that noticeable increase, stepwise increase as we went from year 1 to 2 to 3. And the same thing happened here at site 2. And same thing with crude protein percentage on a dry matter basis. Stepwise increase here. And in this particular site, we didn't see the same kind of stepwise increase. But overall, we were still seeing a difference here. It was an increase in those next years compared to the year 1. So is it worth it for the less labor aspect of it? So in terms of bale setup, we're not going out every day or every other day, every couple of days to place a new bale. We kind of have that one day of getting all of the bales set out for ourselves using equipment just that one time. Fencing setup. So that initial setup, whether you're going out and putting in all of your posts at one time or just the 3 rows and then moving them along, rather than having to move the bales though, I know in our situation, we're getting the tractor to start, we're opening up barn doors, we're opening up gates, we're driving out there, we're dropping the bale, we're cutting it off, and then we're going and putting everything back. So in terms of that, the fencing setup would be, it's a lot quicker, and I've heard a lot of farmer reports that in general, it's very easy for them to go out for a couple minutes, move some fencing and come back. Moving hay frames needs to be a consideration. I also kind of put that in an initial startup cost section, because depending on how many bales you need to feed at a time, I don't have that many hay rings at this point in time, so there would be the purchasing aspect of rings that are easy to move without equipment. You need to be able to roll them to the next bale, considering what pastures you're going to be using that in, because I know a lot of my fields, with that one field that's that 15 to 20% slope, I'm not rolling bale rings. Because there's a very real risk that it gets away from you on accident. So
You're calling the neighbor, there's one coming your way.
For the same reason we struggle to make hay every once in a while with ground bales, I don't want to be rolling rings around. So I would, for my particular situation, it would be a lot easier to just graze without the rings. But that is a personal preference sort of thing. You can wait and see how your livestock eat the bales, go ahead and.
Weeds also help prevent the cows rolling.
Correct, that is a very good point. Cows would, or the rings would help prevent the cows from rolling the bales down the hill. Cow calf scenarios where you've got a bull in there who likes to push on things all the time. That could be a very real problem. So yeah, just kind of keeping some of those things in mind. Yeah, the biggest labor savings that I've heard reported across the board is the fact that you're moving bales in bulk one time. Some other little things to try and consider: never graze twice in a pasture in one winter season. So if you go through all of your hay bales, through all the pastures, and you're like, I still have like more winter left, I need to feed more hay, and you want to go set out some bales because weather conditions are fine. It can cause a lot of damage to do that one pasture a second time. And you may need to do some reseeding, or you may have to hold off on spring grazing of that field because you've knocked it back too far. That makes sense? So don't circle back to another field. You can implement this practice in existing pastures or hay fields. If you're gonna do it in a hay field, I recommend grazing early to give that manure and hay time to break down before you actually need to start making hay off of it. I think a lot of considerations need to be made too, whether that hay is being used for your own operation, or if you also sell hay to other people. So it would be better to utilize this practice on hay that's for your own livestock rather than ones that you would sell. So you don't end up with manure or hay chaff or whatever in fresh bales for customers. I thought I'd taken that out, but it was a random thought that I had was smaller round bales for sheep safety, because they tend to eat from the bottom, they make this nice mushroom and it wants to fall over. That's another scenario where rings may help out a little bit so they're not climbing under there. This is also something that can help reduce brush encroachment. So putting it into a heavily brushed area to help knock that back. And maybe to incorporate some seed in a silvo pasture setting as well, which may build itself. So some concluding thoughts. I have no idea what time it is. I said earlier, and my watch is all broke. Mindset of there's no such thing as wasted feed. So this is where bale grazing can be a little bit controversial for people, is they look out there and they're like, the cows wasted so much hay. But that's not entirely the point of bale grazing. We're looking to give them the extra forage that they need with the hay because it's winter, we don't have enough pasture. And also to capitalize on a lot of that extra nutrients and anything left over from the hay that can be used to grow more forage next year. If you're deciding to do this, you already need to have some good management in place. This is not somebody for a continuous person to try and implement. You need to already have a really good rotational grazing plan. Reasonable stocking rates, cattle that respect electric fencing, because there's always going to be that feed on the other side, and they're going to want to get over there. A willingness to try something new, and just understanding, we say this all the time in farming, right? It's not a one size fits all. There are some tweaks that you're going to have to make. You kind of take the big picture and make it work for your own operation. Yeah.
So along that one size fits all, I know some people will unroll the bales.
Yeah.
And have you seen any data there? Does it change anything at all?
All besides, obviously, someone's out there unrolling bale as far as management, as far as nutrient utilization of the bale, door distribution. Does it change anything at all?
I have not looked specifically at the differences in research part of it. I can't imagine it would change it too much because the hay out there and the cattle are still utilizing it. There is more waste involved. And so the breakdown of that hay.
And unrolling it, but you want.
Yeah, when you're unrolling it, there's typically more waste left behind. And so the breakdown of that hay may take longer. So it would take longer to utilize those nutrients for the soil to be able to utilize those nutrients and for that organic matter to start building up. Yeah, when you're unrolling bales, you're giving them more surface area to walk on, to poop on, to lay on. Yes. So, I mean, you're still getting a lot of the benefits. It's just, they're going to waste more. Yeah.
I would say I both unroll and some combination of bale graze or bale or feed hair, and stuff like that. And in terms of maintaining sod and like in our climate, which I'm also in Maryland, where we don't have that vertical ground, unrolling, I think does a much better job of maintaining your sod cover, or the reverse of saying you have one bale, whether it's on rain or on the ground, it's almost impossible not to have around that, even if it's one bale, do the rain every time I finish that bale. Or if I don't have a mud hole, if I see directly on the ground, there's a lot of ways, making no such thing as waste of hay, but the layer of like hay that's left is thick enough it's gonna hold the sun. Unless you're doing some sort of. Yeah, so when you're unrolling it, you're giving the cows more of that surface area. So they're walking on more area, they're not condensed around that bale, so it makes a lot of sense, and that is a struggle that you have with the bale grazing, is you've got a lot of animals concentrated around one bale. And it just depends on that, make sure you're, depending on how many livestock you have,
You've got enough bales for like 10 cows per bale or 20 to 25 sheep per bale, so that they're not all trying to get there and fight for feed. But yes, that can be a scenario that you may have, as you could still end up with mud around there. And as they eat down that hay, there is that thicker waste center as compared to when you're rolling it out and it's thinner already. So they're utilizing that, and just don't quite have as much thickness left.
For unrolled hay by one, feeding high quality base, they want to feed it, and two, making sure you're unrolling it on clean ground. So like continuing to move that fence, so you're putting it on a clean ground. Like I've seen when I leave anything, stop for several days and then try to unroll it with that, it increases a lot more. High quality hay on top grass.
Yep, and that's another reason, if you're gonna try and bale graze on hay ground that you're gonna utilize later, you need time for that manure to break down, because a lot of times there's also refusal of hay that has had manure put on it too recently.
I love bale grazing, but I love the context of bale grazing, whatever that looks like, so whether it's rolling bales out, not necessarily bale grazing in the winter, but bale grazing in the fall, to save stockpile, with summary. We need a good, bad, and ugly of bale grazing, because there's so much context. So one question I have, and more maybe close to the truth, is, so Jen can help me. So in Vermont, NRCS is going to, or is considering paying for bale grazing practice. I don't know what we're gonna call it, the 5 whatever. So there is a lot of controversy from a lot of controversy because depending on how you do it will actually hurt the environment or help the environment. So how they're all, so it's kind of a big topic, this bale grazing. My buddy Steve Benyon, I mean, dude, you got like 10 inches of rain. You can do this. Just context back here in the Northeast where the first of November is a little harder. And then I thought it was hilarious. Ed has, he's putting a ring on the side of the hill. When I have hills, I roll it down the hill. It's great. I put it off the top and let it roll. And then on my flat, I do the bale grazing, there's so much. But now the federal agencies are looking at bale grazing, agroforestry, some other practices, starting to maybe pay for it. I'm really interested in how that's all going to work.
Yeah, and so know the different stipulations for federal funding for everything. I don't know all those. Bale grazing was accepted in our state, but it's still very new. And so it's something that you would want to talk to your NRCS county tech to learn kind of what all the details of that are. Go ahead.
I work for the equipment company, so we have
The hustler bale and roll, put the bale
basically into a winter. It's not just 3 point unroll the whole bag, but their research is saying it won't do as much damage, cows can still pick up and eat it because it's in like a smaller windrow, it's not a 4 foot long slaw. Now granted, you're still going out there every other day, but they're saying you go out and roll 2-3 days worth of hay depending on the weather. So would that be similar results to the bale grazing?
Yeah.
But just.
Kind of like, kind of like what we were talking about, similar results, it was just a different way of doing it, and potentially that less damage and.
They recommend using like a pasture drag in the spring to just help scatter and break and everything up.
I thought about something like that, I thought about even going through the tender afterwards to try and truss that. It may be too thick to the ground. Yeah, that could happen. Yeah, I was getting there. You could break the tender. It's a possibility. Yeah, but then you're going out there with tractor and fuel, right?
Could I? I was going to Jane Harrow one year. I decided to go out and look at dung beetles first. And I looked at, okay, we're talking probably April, and I'm breaking out the cow pies. I found dung beetles in every one of my cow pies. And that was when I decided we'll let Mother Nature take care of it. I will save the diesel fuel and the time on the tractor.
Yeah, that's a really great indicator of knowing that your soil is kind of where it needs to be. Going out and checking for them beetles. Yep. That's awesome.
Just wondering about reseeding those bare plots. How do you do that grass seed? Just scrape it a little bit, like the dung beetles would.
Yes.
It's really bare, there's nothing there.
Yeah, so that's always an option to do. That kind of saves a little time if you have a large area and it makes sense to rent and drill it in. Drilling is usually the better way to make sure you're getting that good seed to soil contact, but yes. You can do it that way, spread some, run a cultipack over it, scrape it so that you get a little bit more contact. You could frost see some clovers in that space, understanding that you're gonna have a lot of clover in that one spot and it may eventually start to take over your fields. There was one gentleman that I listened to a couple of years ago who would plant only forage chicory in those individual spots. That makes me nervous because then I feel like you're gonna end up with chicory throughout an entire field. But there are, several options. Go ahead.
The sod forming species over time will solve a lot of that problem. You may see the mud there, but you've got those rhizomes in that mud. And if you leave a little bit of hay, I like to leave enough hay in the ring when I move it. I'll leave a pitchfork out there and actually mulch the mud area with a little leftover hay. Now keep in mind the cows still get to come back and either bet on it or pick what hay out they want out of that. But I look at it as I'm feeding my earthworms.
Yep.
And so between the rhizomes, any seed that's in that hay, over the long term, I've ended up not doing much reseed.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit if I thought I'd.
Yeah, and you were talking about the livestock being able to have contact through and walk over that and sitting there from the hay into the ground for you. Anything else? Great, thank you.
So thank you all so very much. Sort of concludes our formal presentations for a bit. We're here for a little while, so we've got posters out in the front room. There's still donuts. And I want to encourage any and all to go. We've had such good discussion today and great questions. And let's get some of those questions that are on those priorities pages right there. What's not on those pages that should be on the pages.
We'll be here tomorrow too.
That will also be here tomorrow too. So if you think about it overnight, come back and question if that's all we share. And then so for folks who are coming to dinner this evening, it starts at 6. It's over in Hagerstown at Fireside, and which should be right in your email address for that should have been in your email box this morning. We start with dinner at 6 and our farmer presentation started at 7. And enjoy the time in the afternoon and chatting with each other. Let us know what you think. Thanks, everybody.
Are the companies